Blood isn't everything, she whispered to me as the lawyer closed the folder. My name is Wesley Kerr. I'm 45 years old, and I just watched my stepmother smile while my father's attorney handed everything I built to someone who couldn't tell Douglas fir from pine. The business, Kerr Timberworks, went to Marcus, my stepbrother. 23 years I ran those operations. 23 years of 7 a.m. starts, muddy boots, and handshake deals with suppliers who trusted me more than any contract. Cheryl's whisper hit me like a slap, but I didn't react. I stood up from the mahogany conference table, nodded at the lawyer, and walked out of that office without saying a word. My half-sister Jessica followed me to the parking lot, her eyes red from crying. "Wesley, this isn't right," she said. "Dad always said you were the heart of the business." I unlocked my truck and paused. Maybe he did, but apparently hearts don't inherit lumber yards. The drive back to my place in Spokane gave me time to think. 23 years ago, when I was 22 and fresh out of Washington State, my father Raymond brought me into the family business. Back then, Kerr Timberworks was struggling. Regional competitors were undercutting us, and our supplier relationships were shaky at best. Dad was a good man, but he was better at cutting trees than cutting deals. I changed that. One contract at a time, one relationship at a time. I learned every supplier's delivery schedule, every client's payment patterns, every trucker's preferred routes. When Cascade Lumber needed emergency shipments during the housing boom, I personally drove loads through snowstorms to keep their projects on schedule. When Pacific Mill faced a cash crunch, I extended our payment terms to keep them afloat, and earned their loyalty forever. The business grew because I made it grow. Revenue jumped from $2 million to $12 million under my watch. We employed 37 people across 3 counties. Clients called my cell phone directly because they knew I'd fix their problems. But I never asked for credit, never demanded my name on the letterhead. I figured the work spoke for itself. Marcus, meanwhile, spent his 20s bouncing between college majors and his 30s bouncing between startup ideas that never launched. When he finally joined the family business 3 years ago, Dad gave him a fancy title, Strategic Development Director, and a corner office. Marcus talked about modernizing operations and leveraging synergies, but he couldn't operate a forklift or tell you the difference between kiln-dried and air-dried lumber. Still, Dad doted on him. Cheryl made sure of that. Every family dinner became a showcase for Marcus's latest business school buzzwords while my actual accomplishments got glossed over. I should have seen this coming. The signs were there, subtle but clear. Dad started including Marcus in client meetings where he contributed nothing. Cheryl would steer conversations toward Marcus's vision for the future whenever investors visited. Last month I noticed my signature authority on major contracts had been quietly reduced, but I'd ignored it all, assuming competence would win out over politics. Now I knew better. Growing up, I was the kid who helped Dad stack lumber after school while other kids played sports. My mother died when I was 16, and work became our way of grieving together. We'd spend hours in the yard, organizing inventory, and Dad would tell me stories about building the business from nothing. "This place is more than timber, Wesley," he'd say. "It's about keeping your word. People buy from us because they trust us." When Dad remarried Cheryl 5 years later, everything changed. She brought Marcus into our family, and suddenly, I wasn't the only son anymore. At first I welcomed it. Marcus was smart, charming, and Dad seemed happier having another young man around the house. But Cheryl had plans. She pushed Marcus toward business school while suggesting I should focus on hands-on operations. She'd praise Marcus's academic achievements at dinner while treating my industry knowledge like it was just manual labor. Slowly, Dad started seeing things her way. The real shift began when Marcus graduated with his Master of Business Administration. Dad threw him a party and announced that Marcus would be joining the company as a future leader. I was proud. Family businesses need fresh ideas. What I didn't expect was how quickly Marcus would position himself as the heir apparent. Marcus talked a good game about efficiency and growth strategies, but he didn't understand the fundamentals. When longtime client Harrison Mills called about a rush order, Marcus suggested we charge premium rates because market demand supports aggressive pricing. I had to pull him aside and explain that Harrison had been buying from us for 15 years, and had helped us through tough times. We gave him fair prices because that's how relationships work. But Marcus saw my approach as leaving money on the table. He started documenting these conversations and presenting them to Dad as evidence that my methods were outdated. The warning signs became clearer over time. Dad began asking Marcus for input on decisions I'd been handling independently for decades. When Evergreen Supply offered us an exclusive distribution deal, Marcus pushed for a complicated profit-sharing structure, while I knew they just wanted reliable service. We nearly lost the deal because of his over-engineering. More troubling were the small betrayals. Marcus would schedule client calls without including me, then brief Dad on conversations where key details got lost. He'd suggest process changes that sounded innovative but ignored practical realities. When equipment broke down, he'd propose expensive replacements instead of understanding why our trusted repair relationships mattered. Cheryl reinforced every move. She'd remind Dad that Marcus brought modern perspective while I was stuck in old ways. She'd point out Marcus's master of business administration whenever strategic decisions came up, as if my 2 decades of experience counted for nothing. The final months before Dad's death, I watched my influence shrink. Marcus got invited to bank meetings. Cheryl handled legal consultations. I kept running day-to-day operations, but the bigger decisions happened without me. I told myself it was temporary. Dad was sick, and maybe he needed Marcus's energy to help him feel optimistic about the future. I never imagined he'd actually cut me out completely. The funeral was on a Thursday. The will reading was the following Monday. In between, I spent the weekend going through Dad's office organizing files Marcus would need to understand the business he'd just inherited. That's when I found the real estate folder. Dad had been quietly moving assets around. The main timber yard property, which I'd assumed was owned by the company, had been transferred to a family trust controlled by Cheryl. Equipment leases I'd negotiated were restructured with Marcus as the guarantor. Even the company bank accounts had been switched to require dual signatures, Marcus and Cheryl. I sat in Dad's leather chair, looking at documents that proved this wasn't a sudden decision. This had been planned for months, maybe years. Every contract I'd worked on, every relationship I'd built, every improvement I'd made, and it was all being handed to someone who didn't earn it. But the worst part was the letter. Hidden in Dad's desk drawer, I found a draft of a note he'd apparently planned to give me. It was never finished, but I could read his handwriting clearly. Wesley, you've been the backbone of this business since you were 22. I know this decision might seem unfair, but Marcus needs this opportunity to prove himself. You're strong enough to build something new. He isn't strong enough to live in your shadow. I read it 3 times before folding it back up. He knew. Dad knew exactly what he was doing to me, and he'd convinced himself it was some kind of favor. He thought I was so capable that I didn't need the business I'd spent my adult life building. He thought Marcus was so fragile that he needed everything handed to him. I didn't throw anything. I didn't yell. I just sat there for an hour, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. When Jessica called that evening to check on me, I kept my voice steady. "How are you handling all this?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. "Marcus got what he wanted. Now he gets to prove he can handle it." "But Wesley, you built that company. Everyone knows that." "Yeah, well, now everyone gets to see what it looks like without me." After hanging up, I walked out to my garage and pulled out a box I'd been saving. Inside were business cards, letterhead, and incorporation papers for a company I'd registered 6 years ago but never activated. Cascade Timber Solutions. I'd set it up during a particularly bad month when I'd wondered if I should go independent. The paperwork had been sitting there ever since, like a backup plan I'd hoped I'd never need. I powered up my laptop and started making a list, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd actually controlled all along. The list was longer than I'd expected. Marcus had inherited a company, but I'd built the relationships, negotiated the contracts, and earned the trust. Those things weren't assets you could transfer with a signature. They were assets that walked out the door with me. The morning after the will reading, I drove to the lumber yard at my usual time. Marcus's BMW was already in the parking lot, the first time he'd arrived before 8 a.m. in 3 years. I found him in Dad's office, sitting behind the desk like he belonged there. Wesley, he said without looking up from his laptop. Good. You're here. I've been reviewing our operational structure and I think we need to make some immediate changes. I leaned against the door frame. What kind of changes? Well, for starters, I'm going to be taking a more hands-on approach to client relationships. I've already scheduled meetings with our top 5 accounts this week. I want to introduce myself as the new owner and discuss how we can optimize their contracts. My stomach dropped. Marcus, these relationships took years to build. Barging in with talk about optimization is going to make them nervous. He finally looked up and I could see Cheryl's smugness in his expression. Wesley, I appreciate everything you've done here, but I've got a master of business administration and a fresh perspective. These clients need to understand that Kerr Timberworks is evolving. Into what? Into a modern data-driven operation that maximizes value for all stakeholders. I walked into the office and sat down across from him. Marcus, Harrison Mills has been buying from us for 15 years. Pacific Lumber trusts us because we've never broken a promise. These aren't stakeholders, they're relationships. Exactly my point, he said, closing his laptop. We've been leaving money on the table by treating business like it's personal. These relationships need to be profitable first, friendly second. Over the next 3 days, I watched Marcus systematically alienate our best clients. He rescheduled deliveries to optimize our truck routes without consulting anyone about what that meant for their project timelines. He proposed new pricing structures that would increase our margins but ignore the loyalty discounts I'd built into long-term partnerships. When Harrison Mills called me directly to complain about Marcus's attitude, I found myself in an impossible position. "What's going on over there, Wesley?" Harrison asked. "This kid comes in telling me we need to restructure our partnership for mutual optimization. I've been buying lumber for 30 years, and I've never heard such nonsense. Harrison, Marcus is still learning the business. Give him some time." "Time for what? To price us out of working with you? He wants to increase our rates by 20% and eliminate our payment terms extension. You know our seasonal cash flow issues. This would kill our relationship." I promised to talk to Marcus, but when I approached him about Harrison's concerns, he brushed me off. "Wesley, you're too emotionally attached to these old agreements. Harrison Mills represents 12% of our annual revenue. If they can't pay market rates, we'll find clients who can. Marcus, they represent 12% of our revenue because I've spent 15 years making sure they stay happy. You can't just replace that overnight. Watch me." By Friday, I had 3 more angry clients calling my personal phone. Marcus had demanded immediate payment from Pacific Lumber, even though they'd been on a 60-day cycle for 8 years. He'd tried to renegotiate our exclusive arrangement with Evergreen Supply, suggesting they should pay us for the privilege of being our preferred vendor. The final straw came when I overheard him on a call with our biggest lumber supplier, Cascade Mill. "I don't care what my stepbrother promised you," Marcus was saying. "I'm the owner now and we're going to bid this contract out to multiple suppliers. Your pricing needs to be competitive if you want to keep our business." I walked into his office and quietly closed the door. "Marcus, Cascade Mill has been our primary supplier for 6 years. They gave us preferential pricing during the recession and priority shipping during supply shortages. You can't just threaten them." "Wesley, this is exactly the kind of thinking that's held this company back. Loyalty doesn't show up on balance sheets." "No, but trust does. And you're burning through 20 years of it in 1 week." He stood up and faced me. "This is my company now, Wesley. If you can't support my vision, maybe you should consider other options." I stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Maybe I should. That evening I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and my laptop, researching something that had been nagging at me. Marcus's confidence seemed too calculated, too specific. Nobody was that arrogant without backup. I started with public records. The family trust that now controlled our real estate had been established 18 months ago. Not recently like I'd assumed. Cheryl had been planning this transfer long before Dad got sick. But more interesting were the corporate filings I found for something called Dillon Holdings, Marcus's personal investment entity created 2 years ago. A few phone calls to industry contacts revealed the bigger picture. My friend Janet at Northwest Lumber mentioned that Marcus had been asking questions about our supplier relationships for months, claiming he was doing strategic analysis for Dad. He'd specifically wanted to know about contract terms, exclusivity arrangements, and pricing structures. Tom Bradley at Regional Bank let slip that Marcus had been in discussions about restructuring our business loans, using projections that assumed significant cost reductions in supplier and labor expenses. But the real revelation came from an unexpected source. My cousin Derek worked in commercial real estate, and when I mentioned the family trust, he got quiet. Wesley, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I helped Cheryl look at some properties about 6 months ago. She was shopping for warehouse space in Tacoma, said she was planning a new business venture. What kind of business? Lumber supply. She specifically asked about proximity to shipping terminals and rail access. Had detailed questions about zoning for industrial operations. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about Marcus inheriting the family business. They were planning to gut it. I spent the weekend digging deeper. Marcus had incorporated Dillon Timber Supply 3 months ago. The business address was a warehouse in Tacoma that Cheryl had quietly purchased through the family trust. They'd even applied for wholesale licensing and begun preliminary discussions with suppliers. The plan was becoming clear. Inherit Kerr Timberworks, extract its valuable contracts and relationships, then shift operations to their new company while letting the original business collapse. They'd keep the profitable parts and dump the legacy obligations, employee pensions, facility maintenance, community commitments. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed the relationships belonged to the Kerr name instead of to me personally. On Monday morning, I made a series of phone calls. Harrison, this is Wesley Kerr. I wanted to give you a heads up about some changes coming to our business relationship. What kind of changes? Well, I'm not going to be with Kerr Timberworks much longer. But I wanted you to know that I'm exploring options to continue serving your lumber needs through a different arrangement. Wesley, if you're leaving, we're probably leaving too. You're the only reason we've stayed loyal to that company. I had similar conversations with Pacific Lumber, Evergreen Supply, and a dozen other key accounts. None of them expressed any interest in continuing relationships with Marcus. All of them asked about following me to whatever I did next. My most important call was to Donald Price at Cascade Mill. Donald, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Are you willing to work with Marcus directly, or have you been dealing with Kerr Timberworks because of me? Donald laughed. Wesley, you personally guaranteed our contract extensions when your company was struggling 3 years ago. You think we're going to stick around for some kid who just threatened to put our business up for bid? So if I told you I was starting something new, I'd ask when you need your first shipment. By Tuesday evening, I had commitments from every critical supplier and promises from 70% of our client base. Marcus thought he'd inherited a business, but what he'd actually inherited was a name and some buildings. The real business was walking out the door with me. Wednesday morning, I activated Cascade Timber Solutions. I'd spent 2 years building the infrastructure without realizing it. The business license was current, the commercial insurance was ready to transfer, and I'd even established preliminary banking relationships during a period when I'd been frustrated with our corporate bank's service. My first move was to quietly secure the warehouse space Derek had mentioned. Not the one Cheryl had bought, but a better facility 2 miles away that the owner had been struggling to lease. I negotiated a 5-year agreement with options to expand, then called the best crew leaders from Kerr Timberworks. Jimmy, this is Wesley. Do you have a few minutes to talk privately? Jimmy Holbrook had been our lead forklift operator for 12 years. He was the guy who trained new hires and kept our inventory organized. More importantly, he was the guy clients trusted to handpick their orders. What's going on, Wesley? Things have been weird around here since Marcus took over. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. How would you feel about making a change? Depends on the change. I'm starting my own operation, same work, same relationships, better pay. You interested? When do we start? Within 2 days, I had commitments from 8 of our 12 best employees. I didn't poach anyone. I simply offered opportunities to people who were already frustrated with Marcus's management style. When word spread that I was planning something new, they came to me. The hardest part was timing the contract transitions. I needed to fulfill existing Kerr Timberworks obligations while positioning myself for new arrangements. My solution was to become a contractor. I called Marcus on Thursday morning. Marcus, I've been thinking about your suggestion that I consider other options. I'd like to propose something that might work for both of us. I'm listening. I'm going to start doing some independent consulting work, but I'm willing to help Kerr Timberworks transition by handling some of our existing client relationships on a contract basis. You'd pay me a fee, and I'd manage the accounts that know me personally. That way, you can focus on developing new business while maintaining revenue from existing relationships. Marcus was silent for a moment. I could almost hear him calculating. He needed those client relationships, but his ego wanted me gone. The contractor arrangement gave him both. What kind of fee are we talking about? 20% of gross revenue from any accounts I manage. That seems high. Marcus, Harrison Mills alone represents over $1 million in annual business. If they walk because of relationship issues, you lose the entire revenue stream. 20% of something is better than 100% of nothing. He agreed, probably because he thought it was temporary. What he didn't realize was that this arrangement gave me legal cover to maintain direct relationships with our key accounts while building my own operation. Over the next week, I began transitioning clients to my contractor services. Officially, they were still buying from Kerr Timberworks. Practically, they were dealing exclusively with me. I handled their orders, managed their deliveries, and solved their problems. Marcus seemed happy because the revenue kept flowing. Cheryl was pleased because I was technically no longer an employee. The clients were satisfied because nothing had changed from their perspective. But behind the scenes, I was building something new. Every client conversation included subtle mentions of my consulting business. Every supplier interaction reinforced my personal relationships. Every employee who joined me was learning our new systems while maintaining their old responsibilities. Marcus thought he was outsourcing his problem accounts to me. Actually, he was paying me to steal his business. The transition period would last exactly 1 month. After that, the contracts would shift to Cascade Timber Solutions, and Kerr Timberworks would discover what a company looks like when it's just buildings and paperwork. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November. I was in my new office at Cascade Timber Solutions, reviewing delivery schedules with Jimmy, when my phone rang. It was Jessica. Wesley, you need to know something. Marcus is in Dad's old office with Cheryl and some guy in a suit. They look panicked. What kind of suit? The kind that carries briefcases and bad news. An hour later, I had my answer. Tom Bradley from Regional Bank called me directly. Wesley, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Kerr Timberworks just defaulted on their operating loan. Marcus came in this morning claiming their revenue dropped by 80% overnight. He's blaming some kind of coordinated vendor conspiracy and asking for emergency extensions. I leaned back in my chair. What did you tell him? Same thing I'd tell anyone whose business model just collapsed. The bank needs collateral recovery to begin immediately. By afternoon, the news was spreading through our small industry community. Kerr Timberworks had lost their major supplier contracts, their key client accounts, and their experienced workforce all in the same month. Equipment payments were bouncing. Payroll was becoming an issue. Marcus called me at 4 p.m. Wesley, we need to talk. This contractor arrangement isn't working out the way we planned. How so? Our clients are leaving, our suppliers are backing out. Something's not right here. Marcus, I've been managing the relationships exactly as we agreed. If they're choosing to work with other vendors, that's a business decision on their part. Bullshit. You've been sabotaging us. I've been doing exactly what you paid me to do, managing client relationships. If those relationships don't want to continue with Kerr Timberworks, that's not sabotage. That's the market speaking. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Wesley, what do you want? I don't want anything, Marcus. You got exactly what Dad left you. Ownership of Kerr Timberworks. Congratulations. But there's no business left. There never was a business, Marcus. There were just relationships, and relationships don't transfer with ownership papers. I hung up and looked out my office window. Across town, the Kerr Timber Works sign was still visible on the building where I'd spent 23 years of my life. Tomorrow, there would probably be bankruptcy notices taped to the doors. But today, for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt at peace. 3 months later, I drove past the old Kerr Timber Works facility. The sign was gone and a for lease banner hung across the front gate. Marcus had filed for bankruptcy protection in January, but there hadn't been enough assets to satisfy the creditors. The building sold at auction to a company that planned to convert it into self-storage units. Jessica told me that Marcus had moved back to Seattle, where he was trying to restart his consulting career. Cheryl had quietly sold the warehouse in Tacoma and was apparently exploring opportunities in real estate development. Neither of them had contacted me since the business collapsed. Cascade Timber Solutions, meanwhile, was thriving. We'd grown from 8 employees to 15, and our client base had expanded beyond the relationships I'd brought from Kerr Timber Works. Word spreads quickly in small industries, and companies that had heard about our service standards were reaching out for quotes. Jimmy Holbrook had become my operations manager, and he'd hired 3 of his former colleagues from other lumber yards. We were building something new, but it felt familiar, like the family business should have felt. On a warm Saturday in March, I was organizing inventory in our main warehouse when Harrison Mills stopped by to check on a custom order. "Wesley, I've got to tell you something," he said, as we walked through the stacks of finished lumber. "In 30 years of business, I've never seen someone handle a transition like you did. Most guys in your situation would have burned everything down." I shrugged. Wasn't my place to burn anything down. I just built something better. Harrison nodded and headed back to his truck. After he left, I stood in the warehouse for a few minutes, listening to the sound of forklifts moving material and workers calling out measurements. It was the same sound I'd grown up with, but it belonged to me now. I walked outside and looked at the sign above our loading dock. Cascade Timber Solutions, established 2024. Sometimes the best revenge is simply building the life you actually wanted.